Because one, the minister doesn't control his budget. He needed funding for things that he was not in control of.
Okay.
And he wouldn't finish his preparations in time, one. Two, he was traveling all the time out of the country. He didn't spend enough time in the country to do what is required to be able to submit this. But the more important thing is that he was in serious discussions with the IMF for a salary increase and other things. Because initially they wanted a 100% salary increase. And the Bretton Woods Institution told them, you don't have the money to do it. So you cannot do that because there are some targets they need to meet to continue with the Extended Credit Facility Program negotiations. So they could not do it. So eventually he came down to 75%. And he was negotiating 75%, but still they told him you cannot finance it because you have to finance it from the domestic resources, domestic tax resources. And he doesn't have the capacity to do that. So eventually they settled for a 30%. So those negotiations were back and forth. I think the IMF was here till end of October. When they could not finish it, the IMF went back to the US. He flew to the US to continue the negotiations. That's what delayed the whole thing. They will spin it. They will tell you anything, but that is the reality. They didn't have the money. And this was the guy who, in September, I think September 23rd, his interview with The Point said that the economy is doing fine. The debt to GDP ratio dropped from 85% to 72 or 72%.
Yeah.
And that it's on a downward trajectory, everything is fine. Just to tell us a few days ago that we are in virtual debt distress. And it's not virtual debt distress, we are in debt distress. That's what he needs to say. So he tried to spin it, and he couldn't. And he ended up telling us that, well, budget support is not coming, the assistance is not what they expect, etc. And all of that happened for a reason. They happened for a reason. That reason is the incompetence, the mismanagement, and the corruption that is riddling this country and this government. That's what's behind the whole thing. And that's why he couldn't submit it. And the Constitution says that. It was 30 days before.
Yeah.
And their own MP, I think is...
Something Jawara.
I think it's not... Yes, anyway, one of the MPs proposed that they move it to 60 days.
Oh, 60 days,
and that's what's required.
To give them more time.
You need time
to
go through this. Because the NAMs, you have to say, are not very much familiar
need time
with
to
these
look
things.
at these things, yeah.
They lack capacity themselves. So they need to sit with subject matter specialists to explain some of these things to them so that they know what they're going to vote for.
Yeah. So
they need time for that. If you give them 30 days, they don't have the time. So they asked for 60 days. And that was a constitutional amendment. Because that's not an entrenched clause, so they could amend it in Parliament.
Yeah.
Now, that was done last year. This year, he deliberately flouted that provision. And to compound it all, when he did, Alaji S. Dabo came out and said, no, you cannot do this. You are outside the deadline. And the speaker, an unelected officer, sits there and he absolves the minister from a violation of the Constitution. The minister violated the Constitution.
Yeah.
So he should have been sanctioned for that. But an unelected member sat there and said, yeah, he violated the Constitution, but he will apologize and we'll move on. Really? He can excuse a violation of the Constitution sitting there as a speaker of in the legislative body that is supposed to be the custodian of those laws. They are the people who adopt those laws. They are the people who have voted the amendment of the Constitution. And this guy violates it. But in a nutshell, that is what is behind the whole thing.